Hey guys, so in this lecture, what we are going to see is property validations. I know in the previous lecture, what we saw was properties, and the way we did was we saw the default properties, we saw how properties are supposed to be passed to the child components, and how state and properties can interact with each other. So in this lecture, what we will see is property validations. So property validation is a very useful way to force correct usage of your components. This will help you during your development to avoid future bugs and also any problems once your app becomes larger. It also makes code more readable since you can see how each component should be used, because components will be sitting around in your app and you need to understand how each one of it can be used, what are the mandatory properties, what is the input versus what is the output. Now that's enough of the theory. Let's get back to the coding and see how we can implement it. So if you can see the screen, I have cleaned up the code little from what we had in the props lecture, and this is more of a skeleton that we use in the second lecture. But you don't have to worry, you can still go and start your coding practice from the start folder. And of course, the end folder will have all the updates that we do in the lecture. Now, properties, the way you define a property for a component is, so let's say I have a component app, which we already see on the screen. I have the header, which we see here, and I have the content, which we see here. So we need to add properties to the content component. You see that? How we add properties to the content component is, we just the way we did the component default properties, we do a content. Instead of default properties, what we do now is a prop types. And this can be a block of code, which is more like a JSON that you prepare. It will just have a key value kind of a pair. So let's say the first property that we want to create is a boolean or an array value. So let's say react dot. So the way you try to access properties and what type of properties is just like in any coding language. When you want to create a string, you say string of type something. Similarly, a boolean of type something or an array of type something. In React, the way you use a property or a validate a property is using the React object that you get out here. So what you do is react dot prop types dot array, because that will tell the component that this is a type of array. And let's say you want to make this a mandatory field. How do you do that? You do a is required, and that's it. That's your property. Let me leave out some enter so that you can see it on top. Okay, so now we have the property array created for us. Let's create our next property as a boolean. Boolean react dot prop types dot bool. So the way you create boolean property is calling a bool and not a boolean keyword. I know it sounds a little different, but that's how React has it internally. And again, if you want, you can make it a required field. The next, instead of creating a variable of some type, let's try to create a function, because components can also expect a function as an input. And how do you do that? So you do a prop, let's call it as function, and then you do a react dot prop types, just the way we had prop types. And instead of bool, what we will do is we will call a func, func. And that's it. It's not complete function, but func, just like the boolean is truncated to 4, the function is truncated to func. The next, let's try to write a number, because that's again a common scenario where you will need to have a number. Prop types dot number. I don't know why they did not do it as a num out here, but that's how it is in the React prop types. So we will use that as a number. Let's try to create a string. So react dot prop types dot string. And if you observe correctly, all these are lowercase because these are properties. So make sure you understand that this is more like a class and this is a property. And then let's try to create an object, because even object is a possibility. So react dot prop types dot object, again lowercase. And once again, you can make any of these as a required field, but let's just stick to these two to start with. Let's save it. Now, just to get things rolling, let's try to create these properties as a default parameter and then see what happens on the screen. And we will try to print it on the screen. So the way we do it is, again, we can use a content dot default props props, and then we can get started as a block of code where you will have a key value type. So let's do a prop array. That's what we had. Let's create a small array, 1 2 3 4 and 5. Let's create the next one, which is prop boolean, and let's call it as should be colon. This should also be a colon, and let's call it as a true, for instance. Let's have the next one, which is function, and of course this has to be a function, so we need to use the function keyword, and then of course it can expect an event. So let's do an event and then do a return. You can return anything, so in this case we return the whatever is passed to the function. Now next we have a prop number, and you can give any number that you want. I'll give a 1. You have a prop string, so now I can give any kind of a string, so you can just say string value boom 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 boom. Okay, so that's your string, and the last one is the prop object. Let's try to create that object, and creating an object is very easy. You just have it in the brackets, and then you have a key value pair. So you have an object name 1 is equals to object value 1. Similarly, let's copy this, make this a 2 and a 3. 2 3, and we should be all set. So what I did was I created content prop types, and I gave in all the properties that my component should require. Then I created the default props so that a default value is assigned to my properties. Now I will try to use the properties in my code. So first of all, let's create this as a div. Let's just be a div. Let's add another div because div needs to be enclosed. So any component that you return from a React component needs to be enclosed in a parent div. And now let's have this as a tabbed, so that you know that these are two different divs. I created another div and I closed the div, and this is where we will display our content. So now our entire component returns one div, and which is this one, you can see, and it may have any child nodes that it wants to. So let's try to print this onto the screen. Let's try to put it in an h2 tag so that it's very visible. h2, and let's try and say array, and then let's just do a this dot props dot prop array, so that we can display the array onto the screen. Similar, rather than h2, let's make it an h4 because it will be very big and it should not be a header. Then let's try to do the same thing with the boolean, and then instead of array this has to be a bool. Let's go and copy this again, and instead of number, let's try to make this a function because that's what we had, and this also a function. So let me just quickly copy paste everything. So after the function we have the number, and just one thing is, when you give a function, you cannot directly give a function because this expects an input. If you remember, we gave it an input and that returns the input output. So let's just call this a 5, and then let's go and add string. So this becomes a string. Then let's go and add object, and let's make this object, and then let's call it as object name 1 so that you can display the first one. And let's try to do it with 2 and 3. Let's save it, and let's wish for this to refresh, and it refreshes the screen, and we can see everything printed out. So you have the array, you have the boolean. It did not get printed because this dot props dot bool. Okay, you need to say if it is true, display true, else display false, because it will display the text accordingly. So it will check for the condition. If it is true, and using the ternary operator, it will display either a true or a false. And once this refreshes, you should be able to see the true out here. Okay, The function will return a 5 because you're passing in a 5 and you're expecting the output to be returning a 5. The next we have the string value. It displays the string. The object value displays the object value. Now let's quickly try and see how the is required impacts. The way you can try it is very easy. You can either just delete this or comment this out. So I comment this out, and now when the page refreshes, you can see nothing displays, but in the console, don't worry about this error. This is for one of the plugins that I have. So here is the error that we need to worry about. So it failed prop type. Prop array is marked as required in the content, but its value is undefined because it was not defined. So we need to make sure that we have to pass in a value. So once you do this, this array should vanish. Let's refresh and the array goes away. Similarly, instead of, let's say, true or false, or probably instead of array, if I pass in a number and refresh the page, it will also give you an error saying that the supplied property was a number instead of an array. So that's the way you can keep your components, more pristine, and you also know what inputs are to be provided to a component when it is to be used, because there will be many developers working on a project over the period of time, and what everyone codes for is something that you need to be aware of. And the best way is to completely have separation of concerns, and of course to have as many details as possible. So having the prop types defined also helps you code better. I'll see you in the next class.